Right. Anin kinawia. Zongabe Dijnakaz Bizing Dunjaba. Shagad Dem. Nishnave and Dao. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chief Scott McLeod of Nipissing First Nation, and I've been asked here this afternoon to speak on behalf of a Chief's delegation that has come here today to present our collective position. As you may know, the federal government is introducing legislation today that would recognize Métis Nation of Ontario's communities as being Section 35 rights holders. It is called the Recognition of Certain Métis Governments in Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan and Métis Self-Government Act. They want to pass this legislation by unanimous consent without debate. The First Nations have been left in the dark and repeatedly been denied any opportunity to even discuss the issue with Canada. We have serious concerns about this legislation and its impact to our collective rights. Mr. Mark Miller and the Liberals are trying to silence the legitimate concerns of First Nations about this proposed legislation by taking the unprecedented and undemocratic step of trying to force it to the House and the Senate without debate. Canada is ignoring substantive concerns and evidence put forth by First Nations, such as the report published by the Waban Tribal Council in the fall of 2022 and the Robinson Huron Wawinamagowin report published in the spring of 2023. These reports provide clear evidence that the MNO's recognition of several communities relies extensively on changing the identities of First Nation individuals in the past into Métis, and simply because they are mixed race, not because they identify with an existing Métis community. We are urging all parliamentarians and any Canadians who care about First Nations rights to read those reports. These are exploratory studies that have found problems with the MNO's research, and we think that, at the very least, Canada has to take a good look at the evidence before moving forward with this legislation. The MNO's assertion in our ancestral and treaty territories have already been dramatically impacting First Nations rights. The MNO has continued to assert broad entitlements to First Nation lands, entitlement to treaty benefits, impact benefits agreements, consultation and engagement, and the list goes on. First Nations in Ontario, in the Ontario region, support the claims of legitimate rights holders. We have been very clear that our central issue is not that we reject all Métis or Métis rights. The issue is that the communities represented by the MNO did not exist historically and cannot be Section 35 rights holders. Recognition of unfounded claims undermine legitimate inherent right holders. We reject any claims of lateral violence. This is about preserving the legitimacy of Indigenous rights. We are protecting our inherent rights given to us by Jemnado, the Creator. Bottom line is we are calling on the Canadian government to pause their current efforts to pass this legislation, and we also call upon the Government of Canada to commit to a transparent and thorough review of the factual and legal concerns raised by First Nations regarding the basis for the Métis of Ontario's claims to hold Section 35 rights. Miigwech.
Open for questions.
Hello, Chiefs. Brett Forster here from CBC Indigenous. How do you see this dispute getting resolved at the end of the day? If the Liberals won't hear your concerns, clearly the MNO is also not backing down from their right to self-govern these communities. How do you see this getting settled?
Well, first and foremost, I think that the fact that we're asking for this to pause and for us to take a look at the data and challenge all the data and make decisions based on factual evidence and not any assumptions or anything of that nature, moving forward, because the legislation really has no mechanism to repeal it after it's put into legislation. We want to see this done beforehand. We're not opposed to any specific legislation, but we do want to make sure that all legislation that pertains to us and our rights is done with us there and in consultation with us, and has to have some factual and legal basis.
And as a follow-up, there are Métis people in Ontario whose ancestry is not in dispute, who do have legitimate ties to Métis communities out west that aren't in question, and that aren't part of these communities who you dispute. What's your message to the legitimate Métis people out there who live in Ontario?
Good afternoon, Chief Wilfred King, Kiasagi Nishnabek, Gulbe First Nation. What's central to this issue is the misapplication of the Pauli decision. What the MNO is asserting is that they have rights that have been derived from R versus Pauli, a Supreme Court of Canada decision. There is a test under Pauli that talks about historic Métis communities and that they were distinct from Anishinaabe communities. They haven't met that test in our territories. There was no historic Métis communities in the territory where I come from. And the other thing is that they're using First Nation membership as part of their root ancestry. And a lot of these members belong to our communities. So the other thing is that the legal test that they had to meet was at the time there was assumed control over the territory, that they haven't met that legal test under Pauli, but it's being universally applied across Ontario and perhaps across Canada. So that's our position.
So Fraser Needham, UPTN National News. We've talked to the Métis Nation of Ontario a number of times about sort of it was a memorandum of understanding that they initially signed with the federal government, and then it's going into legislation today, and they've consistently said that, you know, this has nothing to do with any rights that they didn't have before. There's nothing, no extra land rights or hunting rights, things like that. So what is it that in the language or what you've heard that has your First Nation so concerned about this legislation?
Sure. Chief Shelley Moore Frappier, Tamagami First Nation. So when we're talking about this is not about they are asserting themselves on our land. And on the document on our territory, we have a Métis who has erected a cabin at Pond Lake, who is under asserting their Métis rights in our territory. Tamagami First Nation and Tamiagama Anishinaabe have always been in the position that there are no Métis in our territory. We went to the Supreme Court of Canada with our non-status, anyone who have come to, who are from the document on are us, our Tamiagama Anishinaabe. So, miigwech.
And did you want to answer it as well? I have a follow-up if...
Sure.
Also, we just probably saw it as well, the Manitoba Métis Federation supports your opposition to this legislation, but at the same time they're also pursuing their own sort of, I guess, treaty agreement with the federal government. Is that something that's more acceptable, I guess, the way they're going about it, as opposed to the Métis Nation of Ontario? Or
Chief Wilfred King, Kiasagi Nishnabek, Gulbe First Nation. I know the history of the Métis organizations, both nationally and provincially. The Manitoba Métis Federation supports our position because they don't support MNO's position in relation to its membership. There's no verification of their membership, and that's a fundamental problem. And that's why we're getting the support from the Manitoba Métis Federation, and that was one of the reasons why the Manitoba Métis Federation had left the Métis National Council, because of MNO's position in terms of membership. There's no legitimate membership there, period.
Before we take, if there's any more questions in the room, I would just reminder a reporter online that if you have any questions, use the raise hand function to notify us of your question. If vous avez une question, vous êtes en ligne, utilisez la fonction lever ma main pour nous faire part de votre question.
Can I ask one question just to follow up to Fraser's? Do you accept the Manitoba Métis Federation's right to self-govern and to negotiate a treaty with the federal government? And is it just this membership issue with the MNO that you dispute?
I'll answer that question. The issue with Manitoba BT Federation, it is up to them to have that discussion with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. If there is an agreement between the chiefs in Manitoba with the Manitoba BT Federation, that's not for us to decide. This legislation, though, impacts First Nations across Ontario. So that's our position. If the Manitoba BT Federation has an agreement with the First Nations in Manitoba, that's their business, and that's how we view it. But like I said, this self-government agreement impacts us in Ontario.
No more question in the room? No? No more question online either. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for showing up.